Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou e iwi. Hey, welcome into the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey with co-host Peter Bale. After the storm, maybe before the storm, or many storms. Peter, great to see you.
Bernard, it's very good to see you too. You just told me something alarming because I was talking to you. Everybody can probably see that you're in my house. Not for those who are watching it on the later podcast, of course. But I've been struck that there is basically nowhere to swim safely in Auckland over the past week, although we just looked it up and I noticed that Devonport allegedly is clean. But you said you went for a swim in Waiheke, which is pretty impressive this morning.
There was a lot of stuff in the water, it has to be said, and I didn't put my head under, but it was well worth it. It was wild and it sort of woke me up, which is part of the game, really. But it's been an awful few days of weather, which we must say is made worse by climate change.
Well, it would certainly appear. That. I mean, as we've discussed, and we will discuss today with Catherine Dyer, it's very hard sometimes to identify a particular period of weather, but this is exactly, as we've discussed before, exactly what's forecast. We talked last week in our first podcast of the year about the NIWA report and analysis about the rising temperatures in the sea. This is exactly this kind of circumstance, and also the endurance of some of these tropical cyclone type systems, and the way they're tending to go a little further east than they might have otherwise, and to still retain a tremendous amount of strength. And the frequency of them is what's so extraordinary. And I have a theory, but not that I'm a geologist or a climatologist, but that you've got tremendous slips in many places, and of course today we've seen some that would appear to have been fatal, because the ground just can't take anymore, and our landscape is already so vulnerable to this kind of thing that we're really seeing some consequences here.
Yes, we effed around and now we're finding out, because as we talked about last week, the global oceans have warmed up more than they ever did last year because of human-induced climate change that increased the temperature of the atmosphere, and we're seeing these results come through now. But it has been not just a huge week in our economy, in our weather, and in our politics here in Aotearoa, but tell me about the rest of the world, Peter. I've been trying to keep my head under a parapet.
I've been trying to keep my head under the duvet, and I may go back to the duvet as soon as we finish with this. The news is head spinning, and of course it's the most head spinning person who's generating much of it. We had Donald Trump's Davos speech yesterday, 90 minutes of absolute bollocks, although I am going to do the skateboarding dog from that. And we've got, his appointment of this extraordinary, well, apart from Greenland, which now seems to have been tacoed, Trump always chickens out, except that's going to come back as well. This extraordinary board of peace with people like Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, allegedly, or it would appear, agreeing that they have to pay $1 billion to be on the board of peace if they want to stay for more than 3 years. It is an absolutely extraordinary affront to the United Nations and to the traditional way of doing things. But we'll talk about the traditional way of doing things with Robert Patman. And I was also struck, Bernard, by the really in your area of interest rates, the dollar economics. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who's a very sensible person, former Soros hedge fund manager, talking about the irrelevance of Denmark in the fact of it selling $100 million worth of treasuries. But that's a really interesting issue, that you start selling treasuries, and it's also very much on the on the list of potential actions from the European Union to, the European Union members are the biggest holders. I actually thought it must be China, but European Union members are in fact the biggest holders of US treasuries.
Collectively, although when you look at the actual stats, it shows that the Cayman Islands.
Oh, really? Yes, I know
big...
them. Cayman's is very wealthy. Yeah. Huge. Yeah. Speaking of superpowers, yeah.
The Chinese in particular have been tiptoeing back from their holdings of treasuries over the last 4 or 5 years. They know how to quietly exit a position. And that's the problem for the Europeans. If they were to dump their treasuries right now, the prices of those treasuries would collapse. B, they'd have to buy something else with the money. Now, they could buy their own bonds. That'd be exciting. Secondly, they could buy gold. That's what everyone else seems to be doing right now. Or they could buy New Zealand government bonds if only we'd sell them to the Europeans. So that is a potential shift in the global landscape. And it is interesting that Trump did taco out today. So the news is that he threatened tariffs on those who supported...
I'm not actually convinced that it is a taco yet, but carry on. Yep.
He threatened tariffs against those who supported Greenland's bid to stay in Denmark. And then after a conniption on the global stock markets and bond markets last night, where it looked like finally the global bond vigilantes were actually going to finally say no more to Trump, Trump said, okay, I won't invade Greenland. But you think that it's not really a taco, that he's going to do something else?
No, and I don't. I mean, because it's Daddy Mark Rutte who has brought him around. But there were so many threats contained within his 90-minute speech to Davos that there's still a lot to go. And of course, I just called up the Dow. It's up 1.2%. The Russell 2000, the wider index, is up 2%. There's a shitload of money to be made on the upside here. You essentially buy into any Trump-related dip, and you've made a lot of money on the stock market. So, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we'll talk about that. I also wanted to mention, because we often mention media, Israel killed 3 further journalists in Gaza today or overnight. This is well over 100 journalists. And I think the trouble is, as with all of these Trumpian things, we've declared peace in Gaza, and yet it is a hell of a mess still going on. But particularly for people there, people trying to report it, there are still no international journalists being allowed in. And now we've seen further extraordinary encroachments in the West Bank. An Israeli demand that UNRWA closes its space on the West Bank. It's a pretty diabolical situation that is very difficult to report at the moment, and it's also very quiet. Yeah. Yeah, I think we might actually do something. Jonathan Lyons, who we had on a couple of months ago, actually several months ago now, because it was when Trump joined the Israeli bombardment of Iran, is prepared to come back and talk to us about that. And I think it would be really interesting to look at why it fizzled. Bernard, according to the people watching it on YouTube, your sound has gone off, but I can hear you. I can hear you through the riverside. So there's something going wrong with the feed to YouTube. Yep. Good. Okay. Maybe just move the mic on, because we've just had to do an instant change. I don't think so. To the people asking this, it's not that he's muted, because we can hear him on the software we use for the show. But I can be as somebody says, I can be your messenger, which in a sense I am. Now, the other thing, just speaking of our swimming activities, Bernard, you wanted to talk about some New Zealand things. And one of the things we talked about, because we've both noticed it and are kind of interested in it, is this sudden burst in awareness about people claiming, collecting shellfish and mollusks and so on from our rock pools, whether it's at Muriwai or in Whangaparoa. But it's the Whangaparoa people who have really delivered a tremendous amount of activity on this. It's been on the news, and Shane Jones has stepped into it, because essentially people are accusing Asian immigrants of stripping our rock pools. And you think, and I think as well, that this is going to be an interesting political issue. Bernard, sorry, our producer Simon is suggesting that you leave and come back in again. I'll just do a jig and my Peter Sellers impression from the party. Birdie num num, birdie num num, birdie num num. I will try and get Bernard back in again in a moment, everybody. If I'm just reading, in fact, the life and death of Peter Sellers, an absolutely enormous biography about him, and it means that I'm going to be spending a lot of time watching old Peter Sellers movies, including the Party, which is somewhat ideologically incorrect.
Can you hear me now?
Right. Can everybody hear? But everybody on the YouTube, can you hear Bernard now? Bernard,
can you hear me
please.
now?
I've just been going birdie num num from Peter Sellers.
That must have been quite entertaining. Can people hear me now? This is the main thing.
Yes, they can hear you now.
Oh, good.
Excellent.
That's
so
fantastic.
Bernard, we raised this issue of the quite strident attempts, particularly in Whangaparoa, to deal with people or combat people, particularly Asian people, it would appear, clearing out mollusks and everything. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of these sleeper issues in the campaign. Shane Jones has already jumped on it to make the argument we need to reduce mass migration. It's worth noting, of course, though, that New Zealand First says this every time, and when they get into government, migration actually increases, because New Zealand First is not against temporary worker migration. They're against permanent residency, and have used, frankly, a racist dog whistle against Chinese migration. Interestingly, not Indian migration, because there are an awful lot of New Zealand First members from Indian backgrounds. But this is going to come up. And as we've seen overseas, for example, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party is now well over 20% in the Australian polls and closing in on the official opposition against Labor. So there is a real risk of a reform type situation in the UK happening in Australia. And the fastest rising party in the polls in New Zealand is, of course, New Zealand First. And this year, I think, is going to be the year of the migration scare campaign. And now that we have an election date, November 7, we can sadly look out for that.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Bernard. And speaking of scares, there's Dr. Catherine Dyer.
Catherine, lovely to see you. We are very happy to see you because... I mean, sadly, the climate is something that just affects us every day, every week now, not in a theoretical way or it's going to happen in a decade's way. It's going to happen last night. And the awful, awful story out of Mount Maunganui is, of course, dominating the news. I'm curious about the effects, not just on our climate of the warming oceans, which we talked about last week, the record high growth in oceans, but also the issues that are connected to a loss of biodiversity. And a really interesting report that's come out of the UK on that. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so as you said, we were talking about ocean heat content last week, and we saw what happens as a result of that is that when the usual lows happen over the oceans, they suddenly get added energy and moisture that gathers really, really quickly. And so, the storm that hit Oakura on Saturday night, there was very little warning of that. There was only warnings like on the night it happened, and that's because of the speed at which those things can really sort of build up when the oceans are that hot. So
Yeah, there's a highly localized
getting a
element
really
to this,
good-
isn't there, Catherine? Some of it can be highly localized, right?
There
The
was for that
intensity
one,
of it.
and then the one that, absolutely, it was very localized, and then the one that has come in behind that, which is another completely separate system, I think, another low that just also blew up very quickly because of all of that moisture and energy. That was obviously much more widely felt. So, what springs to mind about that for me anyway is the fact that we know that, all of that climate change is accelerating much more quickly than we thought it was going to. And these effects are growing over time. And yet in Aotearoa, we've had very little conversation about what kind of adaptation planning we're doing. The government doesn't seem very focused on it. And in fact, they were busy announcing elections yesterday instead of having an emergency conference about what was coming last night. So that part of it really strikes me. The report that has come out recently in the UK, it was a national risk assessment and a national security assessment rather, and they were looking at biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And that report came out back in October, and the government in the UK tried to bury it because it had some pretty explosive content in it. And governments in general don't like external pressure on their agenda and on what people are expecting them to do about issues, and so reports like this can really create a lot of pressure that maybe they're not quite ready to deal with, and so they buried it, but the pressure came on for them to release it, so it came out just last week. That report is looking, as I said, it's looking at global biodiversity loss and the risk of ecosystem collapse, and so the contents in that report, I really recommend people look at it. What they've released is really just an executive summary, so it's missing all of the detailed analysis and evidence that you would expect to have in behind it. So they've just really released the top layer of the report. But that, it doesn't seem like it's been too much watered down for political taste. It's pretty stark, brutal assessment. They're basically saying that all of our critical ecosystem services globally are heading towards collapse. And there are timings for some of these things to start happening in the 2030s or 2050s. Some of the impacts, there are geopolitical impacts, there are impacts around migration, there are, impacts around food security. Just about every impact that they mention we've already seen signs of it happening somewhere in the world before today. What the UK, their conclusion was on that, what they were really warning politicians about was food sovereignty and food security in the UK. So they were basically saying that in the event that these ecosystems collapse, we may not be able to feed the population of the UK. Politicians so far are relying on the fact that they're a relatively rich country and they would be able to buy food on the international market, but that is not a safe bet. When food gets scarce, countries who have an excess of food stop exporting it. They keep it for their own populations, because exporting food when your significant portions of your own population are going hungry is a platinum strategy for
As Stalin knows,
brewing up a revolution,
Yeah.
So, so that gets tightened up really quickly. And every single one of these risks apply to New Zealand. And in fact, probably more starkly than they do in the UK. Because
just list a couple of them, Catherine.
Very long supply chains.
Just list that, Catherine.
Of the
what
impacts.
are they? Just when you say the ones that are particularly relevant to New Zealand.
Okay, so let me see. In this report, they basically saying global ecosystem degradation and collapse threatens UK national security and prosperity. It's a high impact. So they're also talking about cascading risks are likely to include geopolitical instability, economic insecurity, conflict, migration, and increased interstate competition for resources. We're already seeing, we can tick all of those, or we're already seeing impacts from those. Critical ecosystems support major global food production areas and impact, our global climate, water and weather cycles are important for national security. Ecosystem degradation is occurring across all regions, and every critical ecosystem is on a pathway to collapse. There is a realistic... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it really is emphasised by this latest drama around Greenland. One of the reasons Trump wants Greenland so much is A, for the critical minerals that are apparently buried under the ice. B, he's pretty sure that all of his burning of fossil fuels is going to melt that ice. And once that ice is melted around Greenland, you can do shipping through the Arctic Circle in a much easier way and put warships next to Greenland. So the irony is that Donald Trump is causing so much grief in part because of climate change, not just because he's also causing climate change.
I would say every major country, every major power is reacting in real time to this information right now. They are basing their strategies and their international moves on this kind of information, even if they're not making that information publicly available. It is driving just about everything that is happening in the world today, except in Aotearoa, where we seem to be stuck in 90s ideologies about growth and neoliberal,
that's interesting, Catherine, because I was just about
to... we don't seem to be worried at all about what's...
Okay, so before we bring in Robert Patman to... No, forgive me. Imagine that I'm Christopher Luxon, because I just did an impression of Peter Sellers, which apparently went down so well that people want Simon to cut it out. But imagine if I'm Christopher Luxon and I ring you up and say, Catherine, I used to run an airline and I know about global warming. And I'm now concerned with the weaknesses clearly in New Zealand's climate response. What would you have them do?
The three things that specifically I would want to see us focus on is a hell of a lot more focus on local adaptation. So how are local communities set up to deal with the extreme kind of weather that we're seeing at the moment? I would want a big focus on food sovereignty. What would we do if the ships stopped coming? We rely on imports for fertilizers and pesticides, for agricultural machinery imports, and for light diesel to move food around the country. What would we do? What would we do if those ships stopped coming? What would we do if we import a lot of the food that we eat? We don't rely on what we grow locally for some key things. So what would we do in the case of that kind of a crisis? And what should we be doing now to improve our kai sovereignty around that? So those are the two first things, and I can't remember what my third one was. I probably wrote it down somewhere. But,
Can I add one thing in if we're going to do this? And line straight to Christopher Luxon, open letter to Christopher Luxon.
Yeah, here's the thumb, Christopher Luxon. Yeah. Firstly, use all of this cheap solar panels and batteries being pumped out of China right now to immediately do renewable as fast as we can in this country. So we stop having to pay a lot of money for fossil fuels. We make ourselves more resilient. And for example, every single marae in the country should have a battery and solar panel kit on it tomorrow. So that when something happens, we can go down to the marae and we can charge our phones apart from anything else.
I would 100% be focusing on energy resiliency. So energy right across the board, not just how we produce electricity, but reducing our reliance on imported fossil fuels and diesel, and also imported gas, which we're in the process of increasing our dependency on imports instead of going in the other direction. All of that stuff we need to look at how do we become less dependent on external sources and more dependent locally. And the last point I would make is around with that microgrids and community energy. And the last point I would make is about improving our deliberative democracy around having more decision-making power at local levels and less at less centrally held onto. And again, that's another thing that we are moving in the opposite direction on. So basically, every direction that they're running on at the moment, they need to do a 360 and run the other way.
You mean a 180? 360 would bring us back exactly where we are.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I often do that myself, and they've certainly they've certainly done a couple of 360s and just continued on. Thank you so much, Catherine. Now, Robert,
Thank you,
Professor Robert Patman. Excuse me, Bernard is the one who does the good shirts around here.
Oh, that's a lovely shirt, Robert.
It is
very enjoyable.
Do you remember the band called The Good Shirts, which did actually a fantastic song called Holiday in Fiji, I think it was, which is an excellent one. I'll send it to you, Robert, because you probably weren't here when that was going. Robert, we were talking, and it's great to see you.
Thank you.
We were talking about the head-spinning news, and of course the fact that the head-spinning news generally comes from one person who makes our heads spin. And I wanted to, I sent you a note today, and I think people will agree with this. I wanted to focus, if you don't mind, a little bit on Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, who made what appeared to be a very significant speech, which showed some testicles where other people were showing other parts of their bodies, and that he called an end, really, to. Well, he didn't call an end. He said that we were facing a rupture in the international rules-based order, but that it wasn't going to go away. Now, you are Mr. International Rules-Based Order. You want to tell us what you took from that?
I agree with what he said. He said the US-led rules-based international order is over. He said I think there was two crucial dimensions to what I thought was an absolutely superb speech. In fact, I was almost forgiven that Mark Carney had been secretly listening and viewing the Hoon over the last year.
Secretly?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think his advisors were well briefed. And
I'll make sure he gets subscribed. Yep.
There were two real standout dimensions. First of all, this was a long overdue act of defiance.
That'll be Sean Plunkett asking you to appear tomorrow. Carry on.
It was a long overdue act of defiance by a middle power in the world. And we've often commented how limp so many countries have been in the face of policies they disagree with, but they refuse to condemn or criticize. So Carney said one thing. He said, first of all, the softly approach has clearly failed. And that was very important because New Zealand's tried that avenue and it hasn't worked for us either. And I think the other thing, so there was defiance there. The other thing he said is no need to cave in to bullying by great powers. And that turned to the second aspect, which was constructive. So he's both defiant on the one hand, but constructive on the other. And he said, what can be done? And he said, actually quite a lot. And he referred a lot to middle powers, but he was also inviting small powers to join in, by implication at least. And he said that they are the vast majority of countries in the world, and they need to get their act together. Stop being passive, be realistic, look at the great powers through very clear eyes. And it's important that countries which believe in free trade and the rule of law need to act together. And it was a clarion call, I think, and it showed considerable leadership. And I think Mark Carney, I think the point you led with, Peter, was really significant. He deliberately said we're no longer in an international transition per se. There's an absolute rupture. So what he's saying to people is this is no time for nostalgia. And in fact, one of the things that you and I and Bernard...
they always say nostalgia is not what it used to be.
Well, that's right. But I mean, I know we've discussed this before, and forgive me for testing the patience of our viewers and listeners. But, if you look at the policy of our government during the last 12 months, I'm sure it's well-intentioned, but it's full of nostalgia for America that's disappeared. Carney was puncturing that. He's saying, get real. Mr. Trump doesn't share our values or interests, nor does Mr. Putin, and nor does Xi Jinping. But we have to operate pragmatically, which was a reference to the fact he's just concluded a strategic partnership with China. So I thought it had enormous significance for New Zealand.
And Robert, just before Bernard comes in and wants you to bring it back to New Zealand, which we have discussed and I totally want to do. There was one aspect of it, though, that unfortunately, it's Glenn Greenwald, who I detest as a journalist in many respects, brought it up. He also did say that the last 70 years of adherence to an international rules-based order was somewhat mythical, and that we'd all been going along with the idea that that wouldn't be derailed whenever a great power wanted it to be. So does that not challenge your?
That's why I get frustrated when people, try to take me to task. I've never subscribed to the view that the rules-based order was an existing fact. What I've said was, it's an aspiration for middle powers and smaller powers because it's a much better world for them to live in. And we all know that the veto powers of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council are completely incompatible with a rules-based international order. So we shouldn't give up on the aspiration, but we should be looking, and he hinted at this, we should be looking to remove the obstacles from realizing a much more solidly grounded international rules-based order, which cannot be, by definition, led by the United States. There's one other implication I'd like to put in.
Please.
I think Carney was warning a lot of liberal democratic leaders. You may be sitting back and saying, oh, Trump's an aberration. We're just going to have to sit this one out and then America will return to normal. He's saying, no, Trump is a symptom of the American political system. And quite frankly, we can't sit in the interim and watch him dismantle things that matter to the majority of countries in the world.
Okay.
And I think the Greenland threat has brought that into sharp focus and has forced, almost reluctantly, the Europeans to develop some spine. And, I think Carney's timing was very good. What really impressed me, actually, was not just the speech, but with the economy in which he expressed himself during the question and answer period. It shows the value of having a first-rate intellect. And he really demonstrated that. He used clear language. Everybody could understand what he was talking about. There was no waffle. He said in 15 minutes, he said more of substance than I've heard from many politicians in years. And I thought his question and answer was as impressive as his presentation.
Bernard.
Robert, you're right. It was absolutely electrifying in a way to hear a public figure talk like that. And also someone who's not a traditional politician. This guy starts out as a central banker who is the governor of the Reserve Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. And you could argue, someone who has said this before, actually. He was the guy who came up with the idea that climate change was really about the tragedy of the horizons. But I'm curious, Robert, what do we do now? Do we, for example, ask Canada to join the CER? Do we get together with Canada, Australia, China?
What would a New Zealand Prime Minister do?
What are the options?
Well, I do think, obviously, Canada and New Zealand have been, on a long-term basis, close partners. We're both in the Five Eyes and the countries know each other well. I do think we should be looking to deepen that relationship. I'm not sure the coalition government will, even if Chris Luxon wanted to, I think he would find it difficult, given the nature of his coalition partners, to move in the direction that we're talking about. That is, moving in a direction where small and middle powers say to the United States, sorry, we agree to disagree with you, and we are going to stand up for the rule of law internationally. And if necessary, we will move the headquarters of the UN to a country which takes it seriously. And in other words, what he was talking about yesterday is another thing, is bottom-up multilateralism. And what I mean by that is that small powers and middle powers actually taking the initiative, not just acting as followers. This is what he's talking about. And the reason that Carney's message was so powerful and struck a chord is because there are so many frustrated people out there who feel they can see the world we live in. They can see the great powers don't have the answers. They can see the void, the vacuum in global leadership. And they're frustrated so many liberal democracies have been sitting on the sidelines, wringing their hands, but not prepared to take some leadership. And I think he has stepped forward, and I think many people have been electrified by the fact someone has come forward with a coherent message that we do not have to put up with this.
Robert, let me ask you two fast questions, and if you could give us two reasonably quick answers,
Sure.
please. Is he a hypocrite, though, to have just gone and done a trade deal and a cuddling up to China deal, and then quote Václav Havel about a communist edict in the Czech Republic when Václav Havel was there about it's that classic thing of they tell us to work and we pretend to work. So is he in fact a hypocrite? And if we're looking at multilateralism from the ground up rather than from what he more or less portrayed as failed or damaged institutions, what do we make of this Board of Peace where, for a mere $1 billion, you can take part in what is essentially a kind of unilateral Security Council?
First question, I don't think he's a hypocrite. He's being pragmatic. He said you do have to operate within the parameters of the world. Canada, like New Zealand, both of those countries, both the countries in question, have the objective of diversifying their foreign trade. And what Mr. Carney is trying to do is to lessen the already heavy dependence on the United States. And China is the second biggest economy in the world. In fact, you could, in a sense, Carney's doing what New Zealand was doing in 2008. Opening up relations with China.
Pivoting.
But I don't think anybody would say to Helen Clark that that's unprincipled and you shouldn't. Some might say that, but I don't think it's a question of caving into China. Just because you trade with a country doesn't mean that you have to accept its political ideas.
And what about the Board of Peace then? What about, because if we're talking about, Carney made a lot of the alleged coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. Is the Board of Peace not just an extension of that, and it's Trump forcing us to acknowledge that the Security Council, the UN, has done an inadequate job, for example, in Gaza or many other places?
But he's the reason why it's done an adequate job, and previous presidents are the reason why it's done an adequate job. And by the way, it's extremely ironic if the US president is trying to develop the Board of Peace as an alternative to the UN, because no one is more privileged than the United States. It's the only power in the United Nations, and it hosts the United Nations with all the advantages, diplomatic advantages that goes with that. It's the only power that can make or break whoever is Secretary General. They always have a crucial role in that position. The Board of Peace, to me, looks dodgy. First of all, I don't see any Palestinian representatives on it. Secondly, Netanyahu has just joined it. He is a war criminal who's wanted by the ICC and an arrest warrant for him. The United States itself, under both Biden, Freudian slip.
Mr. Trident. I like
Biden,
that.
Yeah, it's a good one, wasn't it? Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden both engaged in or were complicit in acts which have been described as genocide. I do think, without any recognition of the right of Palestinian self-determination, I do not think New Zealand should be joining that board. And Mr. Putin's been invited. So look at the characters.
Well, apparently he's agreed, according to Trump, although, yeah. Look at who you'd be dealing with.
I don't think New Zealand should be seriously entertaining that.
Robert, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
And how much longer have you got in Hawea?
Return on Saturday, so
brilliant.
Back
Okay,
to work next week.
See you later. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
very much. Bye.
Wonderful now to welcome in a new guest to the Hoon, Jane Kelsey, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Auckland. Jane, wonderful to see you. As someone who's been watching the global economy, global trade, globalization, the neoliberal project for 30 years, what have you thought of the events of the last couple of weeks?
Well, I must say that I've probably said a swear word about 5 times a day as I've read the latest developments, but at the same time, it's not surprising. One of the things that is a little bit worrying, but understandable, is that people think this is just a Trump phenomenon, when what we've been seeing for at least the last 15 years is a disintegration of what people are referring to as the international rules-based system, especially around areas of trade. And that's disintegration has been led by the US, a number of previous presidents. And so for those of us who are veteran watchers of this, 30 years is quite actually generous of you. I think it's probably more about 19, yes, I hate to think. But it's been clear that it was overstretched, that the model itself was based on assumptions that you could exclude social, environmental, geopolitical, human rights, indigenous rights elements, and so on. And so it's imploding in a way that was rather predictable. What is new is that Trump has dispensed with any attempt to dress up what's happening. And that is, I think, what has thrown people into a panic.
What did you think of Mark Carney's speech, which appears to be a sort of a calling of bullshit on the whole thing? But is it really?
Well, Davos has been really interesting because it's usually the chair place for the neoliberal model and the hyper-globalization agenda that we've seen since the 1980s. And it was always the protests on the outside. Now we're starting to see the disintegration on the inside. And Mark Carney's speech, coming on top of him having just had a meeting with the Chinese leadership as well, is an important signal. But at the same time, if you read what he's actually saying, whilst he is saying that the system is broken and can't be resurrected, what he's actually talking about as alternatives is variations on the theme. Mm-hmm. So he's not actually confronting the fact that that model or that paradigm itself has failed. He's looking at different configurations that don't necessarily center on the US as being a way forward. And that is missing the fundamental causes behind the symptoms that we're seeing coming through from Trump.
So what does New Zealand do now, particularly with a WTO, which seems to be imploding, and this, 50, 60 years certainty about America being our main protector?
I think you would not find the New Zealand trade officials or business people saying they support the system because the US is the main protector. They are true believers in the model of comparative advantage and a very focused system of rules that, whilst they would probably admit are biased, are predictable and provide some more certainty than the current chaos, which they see as the only two alternatives. And that's the problem. And I've often talked to people in MFAT about what are you going to do when this system implodes? How do you have the capacity to have the discussion about what a different regime looks like? One that deals with the climate crisis, one that deals with financial instability and potential for new financial crises, that deals with the grip that the big tech digital players have over data and over everything, including politics. How you deal with the inequalities that are rife within this system. And they have no way of dealing with it, nor do the trade spokespeople from either of the main political parties. And so what makes me hopeful at the moment is that at least the implosion is on the agenda. What makes me depressed is how difficult it's going to be to shift those who have no other way of thinking. And we're looking very closely on this at present because the WTO Ministerial Conference is in Cameroon in the end of March. There is going to be a question of how to deal with the complete disintegration that's occurring there. The New Zealand government's attempt is to try to rescue the WTO and to have some middle powers, developing new alliances that can somehow go on with business as usual.
Yeah.
So our challenge is how we shift that ground.
Jane, let me be slightly provocative because people sort of expect that from me a little bit. When I was a baby journalist, I fully swallowed this orthodoxy of free trade and competitive advantages, you said, natural advantages and so on, and it's what led to the Roger Douglas moment here and the end of farm subsidies and so on. Are you advocating a kind of return to a Bill Such view? Should we be making trekkers and rethinking New Zealand's place in the world as the Switzerland of the South Pacific? Or I mean, your view, and I am being slightly, well, actually deliberately provocative, but I do like the trekker, of course. But what are you suggesting? A sort of return to protectionism, or to what? We did used to make very good Crown Lynn crockery, for example, and the trekker.
Yeah, I worry when those are the options that we look at. And let me repeat, climate crisis, deep poverty issues, digital issues. Now, I work here in the trade space with a Māori entity called Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, which insists that there are other ways of doing these things. There are other value systems. There are other food production systems. There are other ways of dealing with the digital space other than big tech and AI that's run by stolen data, that we can have financial systems that are based on different kinds of agendas. And I think that was dismissed 10 years ago as being off the wall radical. But if we're looking at where alternatives exist now, then it's actually a really attractive space.
Yeah.
And we have some leadership here in that, but so do people in the Pacific who are dealing with the climate crisis, for example, but who are also dealing with pressures, the geopolitical pressures with China and the US and our governments, or dealing with the critical minerals mining pressures and so on. And so I think there's some really good discussions that we can look at in how we build those. It's not going to happen in the next 2 years. I think we can treat the next 2 years as being as chaotic as the first 3 weeks of 2026 has been. But we have to start working out how we can find viable alternatives to what we have.
Yeah, Jane, thank you so much. But Bernard has a final question, but I just want to say to you, I'd love to have you back on, including with that group, at some stage to talk about data sovereignty, because I think that I've tried with the former government science advisor to bring that up, and they just say, well, it's too late, it's all gone, and I don't think that's correct. So thank you so much for coming on and offering an alternative perspective. Bernard, you had a last question for Jane.
Jane, just finally, we now have an election date, December the 7th, and in theory,
November the 7th, Bernard.
Oh,
he didn't push it out that far. Bernard, just start that again. We now have
we now have an election date that's November the 7th. Not that far away, really. And elections are where we're supposed to debate these big questions about future of the nation, how we go forward, what we do as a sovereign nation. What's your sense of whether we'll get a real debate about this in the election, and if there's any real options being put forward by the parties?
The answer is no, we won't. I think the signal for that is if Labor comes in and bails out National on the India-New Zealand FTA, which has very, very little going for it, and we still haven't seen the text, so we've not been able to actually identify where all the fishhooks are. In the past, when we've had real movement happening, it was with protests like the TPPA protests and so on. We've not got that momentum now. And so I think that is a really big challenge as to how we generate that kind of meaningful alternative debate. And I think it will be not just in Aotearoa, but in the Pacific, may happen around COP, and especially with Australia in there with the critical minerals issues that are now coming to the fore and so on. So I think it's trying to broaden that discussion in a way that makes it meaningful for lots of people, and that then forces the political parties to respond.
Jane, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. It's wonderful to get that wider, deeper, longer perspective, and we'd love to have you on again. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Jane.
Ka kite.
So okay, forgive me. David Galler, Dr. David Galler, you're going to come on and tell us about what looks like a vacuum that you're filling. You and some of the other leading characters, specialists, experts in New Zealand health are launching during election year, interestingly, a new initiative to try to put health at the top of the agenda, but public health and also Maori health, I note, is a big factor in this. David, it's really great to have you back. Tell us what this initiative is about, please.
First of all, thanks, Peter, and thanks to you, Bernard, for the opportunity to speak with you today. We've formed an organisation called Kaitiaki Hauora, which is an organisation really of organisations who are interested and in seeing a better future for our public health system, for publicly funded healthcare and publicly provided healthcare, because we see that slipping away in front of our eyes. We see up and down funding, inadequate funding in the face of unchecked demand. We see a drift towards increasing privatisation within the provision of a range of healthcare services, medical services, but also other services as well, with the corporatisation increasingly seen in primary care pharmacies and elsewhere. I want to acknowledge that we have had a private, largely partially public-private primary care system since 1938.
Yeah.
But we're seeing significant changes even in that sector too, and we see enormous benefit in all of us honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, because there is benefit for us all in learning from each other.
And David, but why now?
Well,
David,
now,
because this sounds like something that ought to be coming from the Labour Party.
Yeah, well, I think that the Labour Party, I would imagine, will be supporting us. We are not aligned politically, I have to say that right now. So we are not aligned to a political party. We are not pushing a particularly political barrow. Health has become politicised, but actually, it belongs to us. It belongs to the people. Strangely enough, for people who work in health, they are not allowed to talk about it because it's become politicised, because they are then being political. But actually it belongs to the people, and we need to talk about it because it is slipping away now. And we think, that if we see more of what we've been seeing in the past 2 years or so, that actually we may lose our public health system for good and never get it back.
David,
that's why now.
Thank you.
Yeah. David, I'm curious about this idea that it's politically controversial to say that we should have a public health system where primary health as well as secondary health is provided by the state, when actually fiscally, in a purely accounting save the dollars sense, it's cheaper to do it publicly. And I wonder whether there's a way to jujitsu this story and bring an ACT and say, hey, ACT, by the way, it's cheaper to do it this way.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether you saw the recent report from Deloitte, commissioned in the UK from Lord Aradazi and the Royal Society. It's only recently released. I should have sent it to you actually, but they're talking about an investment in health as an absolute economic imperative. It's a social and economic imperative. We cannot afford not to do it. New Zealand cannot afford to have so many of its people unwell. We need them. We need them there for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and to put their shoulder to the wheel of this nation to improve our productivity. There is a very, very sound economic argument. We know that investments in public health more generally, on average, have a return on investment of 14 to 1. Yet we don't do them. We know that a third of preventable health loss in New Zealand is caused by 3 products, tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy food. Yet we allow the arsonists to run amok. The corporate and the commercial people run amok with that. We do little to actually stem that demand. We know from a recent paper by Andrea Black that the cost of the social and economic costs of poor dental treatment is in the billions. If we are managing short-term costs, that's what we're currently doing. We need to move to an investment approach where we start to look more broadly at how we improve value from our healthcare spend, and not waste so much. Well, waste is the wrong term because it's an imperative to treat people, but use so much of it dealing with the consequences of things that just shouldn't happen to people.
David, sorry, Bernard, may I?
Go for it.
May I? Bernard, David, you've without bringing you into the sort of election year, although you've sort of fairly firmly put yourself into there, the emphasis on the Treaty of Waitangi is really interesting, given the destruction less than 2 years after it was created of the Maori Health Authority. I recall when I interviewed you to get some advice about that when I was doing a story on it, you said, why not do it? Nothing else has worked. Yeah. And yet we have a debate now where it's described often as racial-based health management, and that really the health system should be blind to race.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this emphasis on Maori okay. in your project.
Well, we've got 3 really big areas that we're sort of pointing at. One of them is funding. One of them is around the drift to privatisation. The third one is around titiriti. If I was to think about myself and all of us in New Zealand, what do we need to be successful and reach our potential? Clearly, we need to avoid the kind of pitfalls and the holes that are created, the traps through some of the commercial determinants of health, and the social traps that create so much health damage to us. There needs to be, there are interventions. There's a funding issue here around healthcare services. They need to be adequately funded to meet our need when we need them. If we're going to meet the WHO definition of health, which is an extraordinarily interesting one, we also need, and we know that if we continue to drift towards more and more privatisation, that will not only cost more, as Bernard has said, but that will lead to greater inequity. Because
so let me just ask you a question about the privatisation.
Let me come back. So I'm going to get to Maori.
Of course.
Yeah, and the other thing about privatisation is under the current issue of constraint, where the constraint is workforce, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So as you put more public money into private provision, you are effectively, stripping people out of the public system, the workers who go into the private system, the capacity and the capability of the public system shrinks, and more people miss out on services unless they can pay for it. The third one is really the Māori issue. And, Māori, they have treaty rights here. This is a constitutional issue as much as anything, and there's no denying it. And actually, health is a right. You look at the WHO, you look at all these, health is a fundamental right, and they have constitutional rights to good health, and they're not getting it. So how do you provide it? actually, one of the great things that we can learn from Māori is how they deliver health services to people and how they do that in a holistic way and in a way that genuinely meets the needs of those people in those communities. Now, that will be different for Māori than it will be for, people on Waiheke Island, Bernard, or in Hoon Bay for you, Peter. And they may even be different for me in Westmere, but it will be different. So, this is not kind of the issue for Māori is, number one, it's a constitutional thing, a fundamental right as a result of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Number two, actually, it's what we all want. We all want services that are delivered to us by people who understand who we are, where we come from, what our values are, and can make genuine connections with us. Because actually, I know, and so do Māori, you go along and see a whole lot of people who don't respect you and don't understand that. Are you going to go back? Are you going to follow their advice? Hell no.
David, on the privatisation thing, we've seen that, and I've seen this happen in the UK as well, that the Simeon Brown and Christopher Luxon announced a whole bunch of use of the private sector to cut waiting lists.
Yeah.
My brother's knee is going to be done, I think, 6 or 8 months ahead of time because he's being sent to a private sector place that's going to do it through the health system.
Yeah.
Is that not, a benefit that somebody gets pulled out of the waiting list?
It's a great benefit for your brother. There's no question about that. But actually, it's not for other people, because those people will be missing out as a result of that. The way to fix this is not to rob Peter to pay Paul, it's to invest in growing and expanding our public workforce to meet the needs that we need. Don't actually shift things into the private sector. Put that money into growing our workforce and building up our capacity internally. The constraint
so I want you to come
workforce and other resources.
I want you to come back in another show, possibly with somebody else who we both know, to discuss this debate between, because as you know, many specialists particularly move between the private and the health sector, but they do it deliberately out of conscience and commitment and an acknowledgement of where they got their medical training. Maybe there is a balance between private and public here.
Well, I'm sure there is. Well, I'm going to tell you a quick story if I've got time. Back in the 1980s, before demand so obviously outstripped supply, before we had the obesity epidemic and before we had the globalization of everything, actually I went to visit my partner Emma's uncle, a farmer, in a private hospital in Hastings. He'd had his hip done. He was sitting up in bed, he was drinking a bottle of Coleraine, and he was having a steak and 3 veg for dinner, off silver service, off a linen table napkin. Uncle George chose private because he was one of those people who thought if you pay for it, it must be better. There are people who believe that. He also chose it because actually it suited him. He was busy on his farm. This was a time period where he could do it. Actually, the other thing he chose was the surgeon, because he was a mate of a mate. So those sorts of choices, I'm not trying to deny people those sorts of choices, but when you actually start to promote a private provision at the cost of public provision, we're in trouble. Because I'm not saying we shouldn't have private medicine. What I'm saying is it should be a level playing field here, and it certainly isn't.
David, just finally from me, if we had David Seymour or Christopher Luxon or Nicola Willis on the show, they'd say, David, that's lovely, but we can't afford it.
We can't
Money's
afford
too tight to mention. And New Zealand's a small country, the bottom of the world. We can't afford it. So just tighten the belt.
What's the cost of the status quo, Bernard? I'd be asking Nicola Willis that. What are the Treasury doing to throw ourselves into the future, to tell us what our country's going to look like if we leave things as they are, drifting as they are today? Another thing that I think I'm not sure who wrote the report. It may have been Andrea Black. And Andrea Black on managed decline. It was a report commissioned last year by the ASMS, and that looks forward to 2035, 10 years ahead. And under current settings, only 6.6% of the adult population of New Zealand will meet the WHO definition of health. 6.6%. That's the future. And is that what Luxon and Seymour and Willis want for this country? Do they think that's going to be the way to raise productivity here and give us all a good life? We cannot afford to have so many people sick in this country. We cannot afford to allow demand to go unchecked. We just don't have the resources to have a healthcare system that can keep up with that. I've got to get real.
David,
thank you so much. You're absolutely brilliant as always, and we will have another. I shouldn't say that.
Yeah, let's do it because really we really need to talk.
Yeah, and people have really enjoyed this, enjoyed your input. I do want not something from the other side, just to both sides it, but I'm interested in that public-private thing. But thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you very much for having me, and all the best to you both.
Not at all. People are very grateful to have you there. David, thanks so much.
You. All right.
Bernard, should I just do a swift skateboarding dog, which is that great poet, Steve Bannon, and it kind of sums up a lot of what we've seen this week. And he said of the 90-minute Trump speech, and let's remember what globalist really means. He said, if you're a globalist, you think that Trump flew into Davos and went full gangster. If you're a nationalist, it's the greatest speech since Pericles at Athens. And what I rather like is that somebody replied to him on Twitter afterwards and said, the same Pericles that provoked the Peloponnesian Wars that destroyed Athens. So we're going lowbrow and highbrow at the same time. Thank you, everybody, for and I know everybody appreciated the dialogue with Jane and David, and sorry for a couple of snafus.
It's all right. The recorded version, edited by Simon, will be absolutely perfect.
And it may not have me going birdie num num, birdie num num.
On that note, ka kite anō, everyone. We'll see you all next week. Bye bye.